Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we'll be taking a look at the expansive changes that took place in the United States at the end of the 19th century, the political and social characteristics that are going to define politics in different social orders, as well as the expanse of the American empire. So let's get started. By the 1890s, we see a disastrous series of ecological droughts hit the United States. It meant things were dry and it led to poor harvest. Now, whenever that happens, the amount of food you can produce always goes down. That's not good. Things get worse for American farmers because there are improvements in transportation for all the European markets. So all the stuff that we can produce here is not selling very much there. And for the breadbasket states, for the average farmers in the United States, this was devastating. You are not producing what you need to survive, and what you can produce is not selling very much. For the first time, we see the price of wheat and corn drastically collapse. And this leads to the rise of the Populist Party, a third party group that was all about the farmer. This was originally an organization of different farmer clubs that wanted to work together, and the goal was to make things better for the farmers, the people who make the food. They stressed the idea of cooperation, and some of these co-ops started buying fertilizer, supplies, seeds, and then selling it throughout the infrastructure at fair and sometimes at cost. All the alliances, all these farmer alliances agreed the price of agriculture was too low, the price of getting stuff to market was too high, there was something fundamentally wrong with the American financial system, and there needed to be a major political transformation that needed to happen. A unified Farmers Populist Party didn't really happen, though, because of prejudices, because of conflicting interest. Your southern groups didn't like the idea of a tariff, but your northern groups really did. All the groups believed that all farmers should have a say, but the white farmers didn't think that the African American farmers needed to do anything other than just agree with them. The farming groups, the populist parties, did actually get some traction, and as far as third parties go, this did really well. We see that they're going to win governorships in Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Texas, and they get state senators, state congressmen, mayors, city council members really easy to get on board with this because it's a locals issue. In 1894, the Pullman Company, and this is the same company we talked about last time, who developed the sleeping car, we see they unionize and they walk out. The employees are not happy with the fact they are being paid less. At this time, Pullman employees had to live in the company town, and part of your salary was to pay for your apartment in the company town where everything is made. The company thought it was a great idea. You can live and work in the same place, and that sounds great if you live for your job, but for people who don't, this wasn't great. And the apartments that these guys had it wasn't great to begin with. Other workers start unionizing, and the big guy to start unionizing, lots of them, were Eugene Debs. And the American Railway Union sides with these guys. So you've got one of the largest unions and one of the largest railroad companies who are functionally not working right now. And as the strike continued to go on, the railroad owners go to President Cleveland to get him to, end this. And he does so on the pretext that we need to get the mail moving. We need to make sure that this country is moving forward, and while the strike is going on, that can't happen. He sends the soldiers in to essentially break up the strike, which, if you're aware of constitutional law, this violates the First Amendment, the ability to gather together and protest peacefully. The strike after this was functionally broken. Eugene Debs, the union leader of the American Railway Union, he was held in contempt of prison, joined the Socialist Party in 1897, and he was so successful as a public speaker, as an orator, and for reaching the average person, he runs for president 5 different times and really got a lot of attention, the last couple. The history of money in this country has been definitely one that's a little peculiar. For a while, you could take paper currency and exchange it for bullion. If you went into a bank with $10, you could exchange that for $10 in bullion. That was no longer feasible by the mid-19th century, is because there's so many people and the economy has grown so much, and bullion is rather uncommon. So we see they started also trading out with silver, and gold and silver seemed to be the 2 metals that were the background of the American economy. Unfortunately, though, things started to be rough for gold and silver. With the big gold rushes, the one in California, Colorado, South Dakota, the price of these precious metals starts falling. And ultimately, there needs to be something else to back it with. You can't have a dollar be worth a dollar if a dollar is worth not a dollar anymore. This meant the dollar, the American dollar, was definitely on uneasy terms. In 1893, we see a catastrophic financial depression happen when the Baring Brothers financial institution, the banking house of Baring Brothers in England, collapsed, and this led to a worldwide industrial depression. And this picture here kind of is an idea of how big this banking institution was. This was the time before bailouts in England, before you could safeguard something like this. So if you're a massive banking system that has tentacles across the whole world and it goes down, it's going to be affected worldwide. In the United States, we see a horrible stream of people who are unemployed. There are essentially armies of people unemployed who at one point went to Washington, D.C. looking for relief. And the government started doing some federal public works, building parks, building bridges, that kind of stuff, the kind of thing that anyone with a hammer and a saw can do the job. Things get really desperate though, and the government was unable to recoup the losses and have liquid cash on hand. So what happens is JP Morgan, one of the wealthiest bankers in the world, both in the 19th century and the history of banking, and a group of other bankers bought $62 million in bonds from the federal government under the assurance that when those bonds came due, half of that money would be paid back in gold. And when it was all said and done, yes, JP Morgan and his banking syndicate did help regulate and stabilize the economy after the 19th century, and all the bond money that was paid back to him and the gold that was paid back to him made him ridiculously wealthier. In 1896, the question of gold or silver was definitely a big ticket item. And our two individuals that we've got are going to be McKinley and Bryan. The Republicans, as you looked at it, it looked like they had a winning ideal. McKinley had a war record, he had experience. Bryan was young, he was inexperienced, and more papers start coming out for McKinley. And this is big. Bryan starts spending money on big speaking tours all across the country. And what McKinley's team does is they start putting McKinley everywhere. His face is on everything. They spent $3.5 million to get pictures, pamphlets, speakers, propaganda literature. At one point, they were even putting little dolls out there that had McKinley, McKinley, McKinley. He is the guy who's going to help us. He's the guy who's going to save us from this time. And he even orchestrated these front porch campaign quote-unquote rallies where you could go to his home and sit next to him and ask him a question about, as president, what are you going to? And he would answer it. This was unprecedented at the time. It was actually really a staged event. The real questions were never really got too far, and the questions that you would ask, he always had a scripted response for. But again, it is huge. Following Reconstruction in the South, we see that things start changing for African Americans. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States made African Americans first, well, 13th first ended slavery. 14th meant any person who had previously been held in bondage was now a free citizen, and if you were born here, you are a free citizen. And the 15th Amendment granted universal male suffrage, said any man who is a citizen, who is over the age of 21, can vote. And initially, we see that these systems are being infringed upon very quickly. Yeah, they came down from the federal government, but there's a lot of people who didn't follow them and didn't want African Americans to have this. The first state that really starts depriving African Americans from voting was Mississippi, and there's a lot of ways that the African Americans were disenfranchised from voting. The first was poll taxes. If you showed up and you wanted to vote, you have to pay this tax. If you show up and you want to vote, you have to pass this literacy test. But the test was almost designed so no one could pass it. For example, certain letters were written that could be read anyways. They would have an L and an F that were read as the same letter. So anyone could fall for it. But again, this was a test that only African Americans were told had to take. The grandfather clause said if your grandfather was a slave in like 1850, you couldn't vote. Well, everyone who had just been freed from slavery would pertain to that. This was so bad that in Louisiana, we see 130,000 African Americans vote in 1896. But were so disenfranchised 4 years later that only 5,000 people voted in 1900. A couple civil rights cases noteworthy do start coming out at this time. The first is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It said that you had to equally treat all people. There had to be equal accommodations for everyone. And that went for about the next 8 years until it was ruled unconstitutional. The reason that this court case of 1875 said it was unconstitutional is private businesses didn't want to facilitate how they could operate. And so it gets thrown out. For those 8 years, we see that anyone legally could be treated the same. The big definitive court case that changed everything for the next 80 years is going to be Plessy v. Ferguson. This is going to say that the court, well, this was a decision by the Supreme Court that said it was legal to segregate people based on race just so long as the accommodations are separate and equal. You could make, here's a drinking fountain for white people, here's a drinking fountain for African American people. And as long as it's the same drinking fountain, it's just in two separate places with two separate placards, that was considered legally acceptable. The obvious problem is that it's very easy to separate them but not make them equal. And that started happening immediately. There is some progress that comes in the components of education. For the time of slavery, we saw that if you were an African-American slave, most slaves were not told how to read, they were not taught how to write at all. So education was one of those things that was just denied to slaves. And very quickly we see groups wanted to have people being able to read. That was a fundamental right. And some of these early schools for African Americans are going to be in churches and backyards and basements. And over time, we see the creation of some vocational trainings and vocational colleges, which are going to be your skills schools. And one of the first big ones was the Hampton Institute, and the second one was the Tuskegee Institute. And Booker T. Washington did that one. These were schools where you could go to and learn a skill. You could learn to be a plumber, a carpenter, a mason, a tailor, that kind of stuff. Booker T. Washington believed that the right approach to fighting segregation in the Atlantic Compromise was not to fight segregation. Not to fight being treated like a second-class citizen. Instead, work on learning a useful skill. Work on learning something. And over time, things would get better. He believed that over time, if this model was followed, eventually white Americans would ask African Americans for help, and that over time, this idea of self-improvement would end segregation. Between 1865 and 1914, we see lots of people heading to this country, and we talked about this last time. Specifically, we see about 25 million foreigners are going to start entering the United States. And there's a lot of reasons that that happens. We see new tech is going to make it easier to cross. There's new factory jobs. Even with the economic collapse, lots of land that's relatively cheap is very appealing to anyone who has even a little money. But new immigration laws are also going to be put into play. We see that this was started because of a fear that there's so many new people who are showing up from outside the United States. By the early 20th century, half the labor force was not born in this country. And before 1882, we even see laws that are created that are going to bar people from entering. The Chinese were not allowed to enter for a while. If you were a criminal, you were not allowed to enter. If you were mentally ill, you're not allowed to enter. And the qualifications for being considered mentally ill might just be you don't speak English and there's no one around who can translate what you're saying. So, oh, this person must clearly not be well. And in that case, you might even be put in an asylum, and that's a scary thought. A lot of older Americans believed that people who were coming here were not going to make the nation stronger. They were going to make the nation weaker. They're going to spread a whole bunch of disease. They're going to put all terrible things out there. And even the idea of the social Darwinist that we talked previously, the social Darwinist would say that you have won the game of society by being rich and powerful. meant, oh no, you can't come in here. You're going to mess up the flow of things. You're going to mess up the purity of this nation. And this is an idea of racism where you have white Americans racist against white Europeaners. It's definitely an alarming situation. We do see at this time changes in women's movements and the kind of creation of women's clubs, temperance organizations, social reform groups, groups that wanted to see big social changes. This is the precursor to the progressive movement, and most of these individuals are going to see transformations happen later on for their causes. The ideas of these groups is to make society better, to clean out dangerous, impure things. And they needed a lot of work, but they were on some interesting approaches. Popularly, though, these were women's groups. So, today we took a look at how the 19th century came to a close, the changing value of certain agricultural and mineral goods, as well as social changes for African Americans, immigrants, and women. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.